everyone. Go out up here, right? Good afternoon. I think it's the afternoon. When Charles Blow said this was the first time that he had spoken in person, I suddenly realized it was the same thing for me. And as wonderful as this is to be here, it's also a little nerve-wracking. Get back on the training wheels. My name's Larry Levy. I'm the Executive Dean of the National Center for Suburban Studies. And almost 14 years ago to the day, I was in this building on the top floor for the very first event of the National Center for Suburban Studies. It was a room filled with politicians and policymakers and academics. Hillary Clinton gave a televised address. It was a great event. And I remember I started off my talk by saying, this is not your mother and father's suburbs anymore. And that was 14 years ago. And you could say the same today. In fact, I could probably say, since the pace of change is so pronounced that it's not even my children's suburbs anymore, and they're getting pretty old. And I remember I said to the group, I said, if you don't understand how important the suburb is, just to pay attention to, much less study, if you've ever been up on the top floor, you can see pretty much 360 degrees. And I said, if you look to the west, framed against the skyscrapers and all the new buildings that were going up in New York City, was Hempstead Village, which is one of the poorest suburban communities in the country. A place that was changing from not only from white to non-white, but from Black to Latino. You could look to the south and you could see the Great South Bay and Hempstead Bays, places where government has given access to all sorts of people. You didn't have to be rich to be able to enjoy the beaches, but you couldn't, for a generation, eat the clams and other shellfish out of it because of all the pollution. And you could look to the east and see the water towers of Levittown, allegedly America's first suburb. We won't even go into that. A place that planted the seeds of racism that still sprout today on Long Island, and we see in many other suburbs. A place with racial covenants that said a person of color could not live there. And even 75 years later, there's still about 1% of the population is Black. And you could go and look north and see the marvelous canopy of the Gold Coast, all the trees where the great estates were broken up into McMansions, and see communities that, when my parents came here and when I was growing up, were largely Jewish, Italian, and Irish, that now were majority Asian. And in some of the communities, as Bruce Springsteen said, in the darkness on the edge of the town, there were large numbers of Latinos, many undocumented, doing all the work, cutting the lawns and tending to the kids. And these are the suburbs that we are going to talk about today. And I have two pieces of good news for you. One is, I'm going to stop speaking, and I'm going to introduce some extraordinary people who will make up our panel. That's the second good. First, let's see, no necessary, well, actually, no, I may have the order right here. Look how they're so good and sitting that way. To my right, architect June Williamson is professor and architecture department chair of the City College of New York's Spitzer School of Architecture. She is co-author with Ellen Dunham Jones of the 2021 Great Places Book Award-winning case studies in retrofitting suburbia, urban design strategies for urgent challenges. A long-awaited sequel to the first book in the series, Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Solutions for Redesigning Suburbs. She also wrote Designing Suburban Futures, New Models from Build a Better Burb, which documents the influential 2010 Urban Design Ideas Competition sponsored by the Long Island Index project of the Rausch Foundation. She has degrees in architecture and urban design from Yale College, MIT, and CCNY. June Williamson, here from a few minutes. And then there's Joy Brown, who I have to interject in the formal, for many years, one of my sister in arms at Newsday when I was a columnist and editorial writer. And she was for a time my boss. I apologize profusely. Joy Brown is a columnist and associate editor at Newsday. She's covered Long Island for almost 4 decades. She's won numerous awards for her work as a reporter, editor, editorial staff development manager, editorial writer, and columnist at the Newsday Media Group. Before joining Newsday, she worked as a reporter for the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, Chicago Tribune, and the Mutual News Network in Washington, D.C. She and her family live in Huntington. Martine Hackett. Well, let's skip over Chris for a second. Martine Hackett is an associate professor and director of Hofstra's Masters of Public Health program. Her previous work experience is as a deputy director at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Bureau of Maternal, Infant, and Reproductive Health, and as a television producer. Martine Hackett's latest research examines the social history of public health in the suburbs and how suburban places impact health outcomes, and she's done a lot of work at the National Center for Urban Studies, real stalwart. Craig Dalton. Craig was recently promoted to Associate Professor of Global Studies and Geography and voted Teacher of the Year, which is a very big deal here, for Hofstra's Calico School. His scholarship focuses on critical data studies, specifically the political and cultural dimensions of geographic data, maps, and associated technology. This fall, he has a new book coming out from Pluto Press titled Data Power: Radical Geographies of Control and Resistance, about corporate geographic surveillance, algorithmic bias, and how to resist them. Back to Chris Niedt. Chris Niedt is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and, in my life, academic director of Hofstra's National Center for Suburban Studies. He is the intellectual grist of our mill. His research focuses on the effects of metropolitan growth and decline on race and class inequality in the suburban U.S., with recent work on the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis, redevelopment in older suburbs, eminent domain, minority entrepreneurship, and the relationship between suburban demographic and political change. He's co-author of Foreclosed America from Stanford University Press and editor of Social Justice in Diverse Suburbs from Temple University Press. Who's first? I'd now like to introduce you and welcome Craig Dalton.
Thank you, Larry, for the introductions, and thank you, everybody, for coming out. Can you hear me all right? I'm going to keep the mask on. My partner's immune suppressed, so take this seriously. I am a geographer, and I actually fulfill that stereotype in that I work with maps. I do data analyses over geographic space. And coming from this perspective, looking at suburbs is always a little bit odd because they don't have to exist. In many other places around the world, we see European cities where you have a very quick transition from dense urban development to agricultural land. In parts of Latin America, we have the outskirts of the city being some of the poorest, most underdeveloped parts of cities. So what is it about American cities that is different? And in particular, present company accepted, suburbs don't get as much attention or respect when we're doing scholarly research. And yet, suburbs are such a common foundational part of American culture and part of American geography that we have to engage suburbs to build a more equitable and more humane American society. This always kind of reminds me of that line from Pirates of the Caribbean: you best start believing in ghost stories because we're in one. So suburb, why do we have suburbs? Why do we have these low density developments surrounding many cities in the United States, and even some cities that don't have a central urban core, but they have suburban development throughout. Places like the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina or Silicon Valley in California. And to answer that, I turn to a core concept in geography. It's landscape. And by that, I don't just mean a school of European oil paint. It's landscape is a reciprocal process. It's a way that people understand place and how that affect material conditions on the ground, and how those material conditions in turn affect the structures, how people see and understand that place. Uh, so cultural discourses and the material world shape one another through a reciprocal, creative, productive process. So let's examine some suburban landscapes. And the areas outside American cities have been attractive places to live for a long time. Larry mentioned Levittown, but they have greener areas, they have cleaner air, there's less crowding, there's a lot of attractive aspects to suburbs. And many early American suburbs, that have eventually been incorporated into American cities, places like Midtown Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, are all part of the city now. But what we see in the in the suburban development in the mid 20th century is something changed. So we see a much wider kind of landscape that had the right combination of material aspects and economic policies and economic regime, discourses, material process, just like our landscape. So suburban, with that mid 20th century development, we have suburban development and living open to many more people, but not everybody. So what kind of technologies are we talking about here? First, foremost, most valorized of them, car. And really with those cars, a system of roads that you can drive. It allowed commuters to go farther, faster, and be less tied to rail lines. So, one could work in the city or work in another suburb increasingly and commute in a car back to that suburban house on the nice, quiet green street, right? This is something that is not just the way many of us live, but also inculcated into lots of visions of American culture. So, along with that, however, we also see things like telephone technologies, television technologies, and eventually, even things like the internet. And I've even seen, looking back into the suburban research as it interfaces with technology, a design of a stove from the 1950s that had television built into the backsplash of the stove. This was the expected form of socialization to happen. And now ever so much more so, right? We can work remotely. Are we going back to the offices? That's an open question in the midst of this pandemic. Some of us will, many of us won't. My partner, for example, will not be. He's got a fully remote job now. So, paired with these technologies, we have discourses that help produce these suburbs, right? We have physical manifestations and technologies. We also have culture and policy, things like low-density, single-use zoning. I know, really fascinating stuff. Believe me, there is actually a musical written. Land allocated for one task or another rather than mixed use. So a residential or commercial space. You can't have a store with a living space above it by these zoning rules. One family per house, one house per lot. And this also, what we see not just with the legalities of zoning, is the cultural valorization of private space. So most everybody has a little bit of green space, the backyard, but especially here on Long Island, there are relatively few large public spaces. The central crossroads where people can exercise or meet and forge social capital through social connection. Places like Union Square or Central Park in Manhattan, they're fewer and farther between in places like Long Island. Jones Beach, in many ways, is kind of the exception that proves the rule. Public spaces, as we call them, are actually frequently privately owned. Places like malls, or old estates, or even Hofstra's campus, which is an old estate. So, landscape. Here again, we see it. It's got a cultural valorization and zoning for private space, shape the material world, what kinds of development, what kind of buildings get built, what kind of roads connect it. which shape ideas, how people build connections, how we build social capital in a suburbanized context. So, a few other things. Exclusionary housing. Larry mentioned it once already, and it is really fundamental to understanding the development of suburbs here. So, whether institutionalized redlining or to exclude racial minorities or house by house racist covenants and restrictions on who can buy land, suburbs were designed to keep racial minorities out, and with different developments for different classes of the people who were in. This became a primary destination for white flight in the mid 20th century. And to a certain extent, this still goes on, if not in law, in cultural practice. As we see in Newsday's 2019 expose on racial discrimination here in Long Island real estate practice. So another one we see that's associated with this, Chris will actually be talking about it in a minute, is post-war subsidies for mortgages and who could get a loan to buy a house. So we see things like the GI Bill, suburban development, etc. And another big one, and I love this one because it's all about geography, is car-centered transportation and infrastructure and policy. So if you have a lot of roads, but they don't all connect. If you have a small suburban street that doesn't have a lot of traffic, well, part of the reason why it doesn't have a lot of traffic is it doesn't go in. So you have to go through long, circuitous routes to connect with the few roads that do have lots of connections. And by having lots of connections, you can actually get to where you're going. Well, the consequences of it is the few roads that do have all the connections get all the traffic. That's where you see backup. That's where you see greater air pollution. But it also means that if you want to walk it, you got to go a lot farther. And it's usually, and I've actually done some research with this with a colleague from health professions and mathematics, much less pedestrian friendly, much less biking. So how do you confront literally the built infrastructure for transportation? And as we'll see, this can mean less physical activity, air pollution, etc. Now, as Larry also mentioned, in recent decades, suburbs have aged and changed a great deal from that tiki-taka houses image that we have in the 20th century. We have new developments pushing for new, different, and more diverse kinds of zoning. California just passed the big law that allowed for multifamily housing to make it more affordable. We have more walking and transitory development, especially along places like the Long Island Railroad and Mineola, Huntington, etc. And American suburbs are getting increasingly economically and racially diverse, though not evenly everywhere. Here on Long Island, it's a bit more of a patchwork, and the borderline between those patchwork can be extreme. For example, there's the famous one road that differentiates Hempstead from Garden City. Excuse me, it's been a long time since I spoke. Hi. So, on one side of that street, I would be hesitant to send my son to the school system. On the other side of that street, I couldn't afford a two-bedroom house. It's a very, very stark divide. So, this can come across as pretty dark, but remember, suburbs are socially produced. They can be improved. It's hard work. It can take a while, but it's possible. Oops, got ahead of myself. No, I didn't. There we go. All right, so we best start believing in suburbs because we're in one. And I want to end with a more hopeful sound of what is possible here. One of the things I do is I partner with students and local nonprofits around making math and geographic analysis. And one of my community partners over the course of the last year is an organization called Docs for Tots. This is a local organization that connects local pediatric care with families in need. And what we've done is we took all of the requests, and they got a lot more requests in the pandemic, and helped them process their data, see where is this, where do we see new needs for kids who need pediatric care. And so we analyzed the data. My student and I put this map together, and now they're using it both for grant funding, grant funding applications, and for their annual report. So using geographic data to make Long Island more livable for more different kinds of people. It's possible. We just have to set ourselves to doing. Then, the last thing I want to say before I sign off, two things I always say. Number one, students, if you find this stuff interesting, check out Geography 60. It's a class where we learn all of this stuff. I think it's a lot of fun, and it's now good for natural science and quantitative reasoning distribution requirements. Second, everybody, if you need a map made, drop me a line. I'm always looking for a good project for my students. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here at our panel. I was moved to speak about the suburbs and public health at President Poser's inauguration symposium today, as we still reckon with COVID-19 pandemic. Because when it comes to our health, place matters. The United States is a suburban nation with over 50% of people living in the suburbs, more than rural or urban areas. Hofstra University sits in the middle of Nassau County, which of course is well known for the home of Levittown and the epitome of post-war mass urbanization. But what better place to discuss how the creation of the suburbs constructed suburban public health problems? Remember that in the United States, the first coronavirus hotspot was in a suburb of Seattle, Kirkland, in the Life Care Center nursing home where 35 people died. And the Westchester suburb of New Rochelle was the first epicenter of the virus in New York. By April 2020, thousands fled the city for the suburbs for more space, decreased risk of contamination, and safety from the coronavirus. Areas just outside of cities for thousands of years have represented an Arcadia, a haven, a retreat from the evil and sicknesses of the city. Cities in the beginning of the 20th century in the United States dramatically framed this connection between public health and place. Hazardous factory work and poisonous emissions increase the risk of death on and off the factory floor. Tenement apartments crowded thousands into small spaces, spreading infectious diseases like tuberculosis, typhus, and yellow fever. Dirty streets, ineffective waste disposal, and decay created foul smells and miasmas or vapors that early public health practitioners thought were the cause of disease. And waves of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and migrating Black Americans from the South were also considered threats to the health of native roots. The selling of suburban life focused on, The selling of suburban life focused early on the health benefits and the hygienic superiority of nature, sunshine, clean air, and your own home. The suburbs also evoked long-held public health practices of separation, segregation, zoning, and maintaining boundaries to keep potentially harmful people out. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly examine how the notion of the superiority of suburban health is actually a paradox. That the 20th century notion of the suburbs has created suburban public health problems, and the suburbs as they exist today maintain a structure that is incompatible with 21st century paradigms of public health and health equity. I will identify three ways this occurs and then look at the possibilities for our suburban public health. First, rapid expansion and the lack of planning in the suburbs caused public health problems, including water contamination, sewage issues, and environmental damage. The suburbs of the 1920s and 30s were not intended to be extensions of the city. What developers were selling and what urban dwellers were buying was a life that rejected the city and embraced the village. Yet they needed to have urban convenience. What was missing yet was the expertise, authority, and organization of how to make these city services that residents demanded a reality in the rapidly growing suburbs. For example, Over 50 years ago, suburban Suffolk County planned to install sewers to replace septic tanks and cesspools as a safer and more hygienic approach to waste collection in single family homes. Today, 75% of the homes in Suffolk County are still not connected to sewers due to mismanagement, cost overruns, and corruption. In 2020, as more people moved out to the east end of Suffolk County, the excess use of septic tanks caused groundwater contamination and algae that threatened the environment. And next, changing suburban demographics and increased heterogeneity in the suburbs presented new public health issues without a sufficient safety. Suburban populations are aging, and earlier infrastructures of single family homes and reliance on private transportation is more of a burden than an advantage. More immigrants are bypassing cities to live in the suburbs, creating issues of language access and cultural approaches to health. And suburbanization of poverty over the last 3 decades has brought a more concern for the sharper increases than have happened in both urban or rural areas. However, many suburbs lack the resources needed for human service programs compared to urban areas. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerability and social needs of thousands of Long Island residents. You may remember seeing lines of hundreds of cars and people lined up with carts right across the street at Nassau Coliseum during food distribution by local food banks to over 4,000 of our neighbors. Finally, suburban communities were built on the notion of separation from the city and city problems, and suburban government supported the separation through home rule and local control. The zoning rights that Craig mentioned were incorporated into the suburban ideas that have allowed them to control what happens within their borders, and often their zoning decisions to reduce lot sizes for new homes, to prevent the development of multifamily housing, to not allow shelters or social services for homeless families, benefit those living inside the borders, but disadvantage those living outside. The prized ability for local suburban jurisdictions to control how and what happens in their own communities leads to the fragmentation and is antithetical to the approach to public health, which prioritizes the public good over individuals. This is where presenting mask wearing in schools as an individual choice or the right of a parent to decide undermines the collective approach to a safer environment to prevent the spread of historical suburban housing policies like racial covenants and practices like redlining, real estate steering, and blockbusting have also created separation and segregation of suburban communities by race ethnicity, with Long Island remaining one of the most racially residentially segregated areas of the country. Racial segregation itself is actually a fundamental cause of health disparities in suburban areas. Even looking at maps within suburban communities consistently will show high COVID rates intersecting with low socioeconomic status areas. When considering our suburban public health future, it's difficult to reconcile how the suburbs can be good for public health outcomes for everybody. But one area that I have been keeping my eye on is Delaware County, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia. Delco is the largest area in the country that does not have a health department, with over 800,000 residents. In 2020, a Democratic majority in the county legislature was elected for the first time since before the Civil War. One of the first pieces of legislation that passed was to establish their own health department. They are now on track to launch a true 21st century suburban health department that centers health equity this January. Their vision prioritizes community collaboration, building on local assets, and providing public health services for all. The separation of the suburbs from the city was always a false separation, more psychological than physiological. The root causes of public health problems, poverty, inequality, gender discrimination, and racism are the same in the city as they are in the suburbs. What's needed for suburban health equity is the courage to see our collective struggle and prioritize the public
First, I want to thank everyone for coming to the session, and I also want to give a special shout out to Professor Dalton for proposing the session in the first place and kind of getting the ball rolling on its organization. So, as we've heard in the first two presentations, suburban landscapes are really ways of cultural discourses and material practices co-constituting a certain place. And in the second presentation, Professor Hackett's presentation, we heard about the impact of discrimination and residential segregation on racial inequalities in health. These single-family, owner-occupied residential landscapes that we've been discussing, I'm going to suggest are also consequential because they played a key role in reproducing and entrenching the racial wealth gap in the United States in the late 20th century. If we go back to Levittown, Time magazine in 1950 profiled William Levitt, and the writers marveled at the dazzling speed of construction in Levittown, New York, just down the road here. Homes were being completed in less than 15 minutes. But the profound effects on the racial wealth gap were much more gradual. They took longer, and they unfolded over decades and over generations. And the nature of wealth itself is that typically, at least, it builds up and drains down over time, right? For individual households, it serves a number of functions. It serves to safeguard a family's future. It provides a safety net in times of adversity. And it also is an opportunity to transfer assets intergenerationally. Discrimination and structural racism have undermined these individual and household decisions for people of color. The sociologists Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro. There we go. No, one more. Sorry. The sociologists Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro, in their landmark study of the racial wealth gap, refer to wealth as a measure of the sedimentation of racial inequality, such that over the long term, structural racism and discrimination in their many forms in the housing market, in the labor market, in business formation, in educational access, in the criminal justice system, all combine to result in cumulative disinvestment and disadvantage. Data from the consumer survey of consumer finances confirms this, revealing persistent Black, white, and Latino white wealth inequality over time. In the post-World War II period, in fact, the ratio between median white household wealth and median Black household wealth has never fallen below 6-to-1. And the Great Recession only widened that gap. And while the gap did begin to close again in the last few years, early data from the Census Pulse survey which began at the beginning of the pandemic, have shown that Black and Latinx renters, homeowners, and business owners, rather, were among those most severely impacted by the pandemic and the resulting recession. So I want to offer a few comments on inequality in both housing and entrepreneurship on Long Island. And let's start for a second with housing, because for most middle-class homeowners, home equity accounts for roughly half of their net wealth. So we can't really understand wealth or wealth inequality without talking about housing. As has already been discussed in the session, public and private discrimination complemented one another to keep people of color out of many suburbs, especially post-war suburbs. These practices are well known and well documented. Restrictive covenants, already mentioned, limited non-white occupancy in many suburbs and were encouraged by the FHA. Realtors, developers, and landlords discriminated against non-white renters and buyers, often openly, until the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and then continued to do so even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act due to its weak enforcement provisions. Whites used mob violence to resist integration, which was often tolerated and even abetted by local police forces. And local governments, as Professor Hackett mentioned, often under pressure from local residents, preempted the siting of affordable housing through exclusionary zoning. The result was racial exclusion and segregation in many newly built suburban communities. In many newly built suburban communities. And then the context of suburban exclusion, supposedly race-blind public policies that favored homeownership ended up transferring tremendous wealth to predominantly white homeowners. This included the provision of FHA and VA loans to suburban homebuyers, which lowered their down payments and their monthly payments. During the first 3 decades of FHA lending, less than 2% of loans went to non-white borrowers. Federal policies also included tax deductions for mortgage interest and property taxes as well. And was a tax expenditure many times larger than the budgets for public housing and for vouchers, a situation that Gail Radford and others have described as the two-tiered housing policy of the welfare state. On the one hand, we have politically embattled programs and underfunded housing programs for the poor and for the working class, and on the other, politically unassailable tax deductions for middle and upper class homeowners. Although those tax breaks, the mortgage interest deduction and the property tax deduction, were reduced somewhat in 2017, their legacy continues. There remains a huge amount of wealth that was transferred to homeowners that it has then been passed on intergenerationally. And all of this, by the way, doesn't even take into account the increased wealth that some households were able to reap when the prices on their homes went up in the market. Civil rights activists did not, of course, accept this status quo, and they fought for fair housing, they fought for fair lending, they fought for desegregating the suburbs. And they won some victories. They won the Fair Housing Act in 1968, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Community Revitalization Act. But this fight was long and slow, and really it continues to the present. Some would argue that fair housing advocates only really gained traction on fair housing in the late 80s and early 1990s with the amendments to the Fair Housing Act and stronger enforcement of the Community Revitalization Act. And indeed, during this period, we start to see rates of black home ownership in particular rise. Unfortunately, so it seemed like suburbs were making some progress towards racial equity. Unfortunately, this was also the period where, these are two pictures of both poor activism protesting discriminatory realtors on Long Island, and Gail Sincato, a member of National People's Action who was very active in the. So we have this growth in black home ownership, in particular in the 1990s, as well as Latino home ownership. But that growth coincided, or in some ways overlapped, with the growth of the subprime market. This was a period, many of us in the room know the story. This was a period in which primarily non-CRA regulated mortgage companies began to make an increasing number of subprime loans, including loans to households that couldn't afford them. They often use predatory tactics to do so. And in our research at the National Center for Suburban Studies, we've mapped where people receive these high interest, unsustainable loans and onto the racial geographies of the region to match very closely, which is what you see in this slide. The consequences of this subprime boom were eventually massive foreclosure across the country and eventually in Long Island specifically. Long Island actually had a later crisis than the initial waves of foreclosure in the Midwest and the Sun Belt. Even as late as 2015, the state comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, reported that foreclosures were still rising in many counties in the state. And Nassau and Suffolk, circled there at the top right, were among the hardest hit. And within Nassau and Suffolk, certain communities had the highest rates of foreclosure, like Uniondale and Hempstead. Families may have suffered the immediate impact of displacement, but the community felt it as well. Vacancies resulted in vandalism, declining property values, and a weakened income base for local government, merchants, and institutions. The nominal recovery that followed really did little to repair the damage. Federal rescue programs for homeowners were grossly inadequate to the level of home finance also dried up. People of color had gone from having little access to credit to ample access to bad credit, and then back again to little access to credit. Home ownership rates, especially for African Americans, fell dramatically in the late 2000s and 2010s to lows that had last been seen during the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Our center released a study in 2014 showing that FHA lenders had stepped in to provide some home finance to majority minority communities, but premiums on these loans had increased at the beginning of the recession, making the loans more expensive. Additionally, large groups of foreclosed homes were transferred into the hands of investors, rather than being offered as an opportunity for first-time homeownership or nonprofit development. So households and communities both lost tremendous wealth and often a sense of control over their own. Some community organizations did push back, however. Local leaders in Hempstead and Uniondale formed community land trusts to rehabilitate vacant homes and resell them as permanently affordable below market rate housing. At the moment, of course, right now in 2021, we don't have a clear sense of how much foreclosures will rise in the next few years. There are reasons to be hopeful, right? Federal and state policymakers, learning from the Great Recession, adopted moratoria that gave households the chance to modify their mortgages. Maybe even more importantly, the Biden administration committed to transfer properties to owner-occupants and nonprofits should there be a massive foreclosures in the coming year. So one key element in an equity agenda for housing is ensuring that housing development organizations have the resources, the technical capacity, and the development opportunities to create housing that will remain affordable over the long term. Ideally, these would be community-controlled organizations like UCLT that work with local civic organizations to integrate affordable housing into broader visions for community revitalization. So finally, having spoken about housing, I also want to offer a briefer comment about minority entrepreneurship on the island. For the last several years, we at the National Center for Suburban Studies have been collaborating with the Center for Entrepreneurship on the Ascend Long Island program. This program, funded by JP Morgan Chase, seeks to strengthen minority entrepreneurship through training in the quote-unquote 3 M's: management skills, market development, and money, or access to capital. Training recently began for the 3rd cohort of participants. Together with Doctors Letitia Vickery and Richard Hayes, I've been surveying and conducting interviews with the participants in this program. And the interviews are broad-ranging, and they touch on the entrepreneur's trajectory, their growth goals, their experiences within Ascend. But we've also asked them about their experiences in the business environment more generally, and what we found is troubling. Many cohort members that we're interviewing, especially those who have operated for several years, are reporting experiences of discrimination and exclusion as they've tried to grow their business. This is even now in the 2010s and the 2020s. This includes discrimination in government contracting and procurement, within informal and formal business networks, in renting commercial space, in client treatment of their employees, right? And in some cases, these experiences have led business owners to turn their efforts to other markets like New York City, or to abandon their business altogether, right? These experiences thus limit the wealth building among households that try to build their wealth through entrepreneurship. And since many of these businesses hire locally, there are negative multiplier effects on local employment. So at the very least, an equity agenda would include proactive steps towards enforcement of existing non-discrimination and MWBE policies, transparent public and private contracting practices, and more proactive steps towards the incorporation of entrepreneurs of color in local business networking groups. And to wrap up, as is in the case with housing, an equity agenda is going to require cooperation between the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, including large institutional nonprofits like Hofstra. It will require ongoing engagement with and leadership from local communities as they chart their futures. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm here. I'm an architect and an urban designer. Students, if you want to do graduate study in architecture, landscape architecture, or urban sustainability, check out the City College of New York, the Spitzer School of Art. So I'm an ardent advocate for the transformation or retrofitting of the unsustainable and non-resilient, sprawling, inefficient, and increasingly obsolete suburbanized landscape of Northern America. Places like this, and this, or this. And I've been researching the topic of retrofitting suburbia for 20 years now, and talking in many publications, including one about Long Island. But the most recent volume came out this past January, Case Studies in Retrofit Suburbia. And through decades of careful study of the deep and rich history of suburbanization, that's already been outlined for you this afternoon, the ideals and design visions, policies and politics the economic and social forces, as well as the collection of many, many case study examples, we've proposed a framework of how processes of retrofitting individual suburban sites, pieces of actual property, may add up over time, incrementally, to reshape the metropolitan areas of Northern America. Suburban retrofitting, then, is a long-term, 50-year project for remaking the metropolis into a more sustainable and resilient, multi-centered urban structure through systemic transformation of large, prototypical, single-use suburban sites, including vacant and obsolete shopping malls, big box stores, office parks, airports, and the like. And we argue that there are 6 urgent challenges for raising the bar on the next generation of suburban retrofits. And I'm quickly going to explain and illustrate each. So first, disrupt auto dependence. Where possible, retrofit for a compact, dynamic mix of so people can park once and do multiple things, or not drive at all. Retrofits must be designed real, complete streets for drivers, yes, of course, but with equal priority for walkers, bikers, transit riders, and freight delivery by truck, van, or in a robot, as in this pilot example in UK. And it's very important to improve and expand mass transit options. So part of this involves repurposing all that asphalt that sort of is so much of the built suburban landscape, as in this example of a former mall in Minnesota. So building on gray fields and parking lots, we can enhance the public realm, support walking, and in this case, this is a green park that replaced a truck loading facility in Oakland. Second challenge, improve public health. Research shows that physical design can support and encourage healthy physical activity. And this is vital in the face of epidemic levels of chronic disease and obesity, including diabetes in this country. And these conditions, of course, increase vulnerability to currently to coronavirus. And these are correlated with the sedentary lifestyle. So retrofits can bank on this knowledge. We can also make the built environment safer from preventable injury and also from crime, address mental wellness, biophilia, and designs to combat loneliness, reduce exposure to polluted air, soil, and water. This example is a pilot project that sought to implement the research linking design to healthy physical activity. It's a 2-block-long retrofitted street that's also more complete, accommodating pedestrians, as you can see, and his best friend. And the redesign also incorporates soft green infrastructure to manage stormwater, which you can see in the foreground with how the curbs are detailed, so the runoff goes into the vegetation. This next example literally addresses disrupting auto dependence, as well as these public health issues, while demonstrating a community activist-driven, progressive YIMBY, or yes in my backyard, kind of process. So this is a figure field sequence which tracks changes over time. From, on the left, a Ford Motors vehicle assembly plant, which was converted to an auto-oriented shopping mall surrounded by big box retail after construction of an interstate. That's what you see in the middle, which cut off the neighborhood from this. And then on the right, you see the emergence of a higher density, mixed-use neighborhood that is walkable, bikeable, with newly accessible access to the waterfront with a bike path and a new transit stop. Here you can see images sort of before on the left and what's emerging right. And a key idea of the community activist group called the Mystic View Task Force was a demand that Assembly Square live up to its name by becoming a place where people could actually assemble together with one another rather than a place where cars were assembled. Third challenge, support an aging population. By 2050, a larger percentage of the US population will be older. The share is expected to grow to 20% or 1/5 of and there will be, as a result, even more 1- and 2-person households will outlive their child-bearing family formation as a result. So how can we address this? Some of the tactics include, and again, how can we address this by design? Focus in. So embrace lifelong communities, planning models that support needs and desires of residents of all ages and by adding an array of new housing choices for downsizers. And again, this isn't rejecting the detached house, but it's adding more choices within the buildings on those parking lots. Allowing accessory dwelling units everywhere. Accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU, is a second unit. Could be a granny flat, terms for that, a backyard. You have to change zoning for that one. And retrofit the existing places where people already live with senior care amenities that they can walk rather than kind of moving them to a campus facility that's separate from everything. So here's an example in Maryland, the adaptation of a nondescript office building into a co-housing facility, a co-housing community with 56 units of varying sizes, and a large percentage of the residents here are of advanced age, call themselves the sages within the co-housing community. And the parking court here, you can see, is converted to a garden, which is overlooked by the exterior galleries, and it's all lushly grown now. This was an image of when it was first constructed. Sure, all vegetation. In the Twin Cities area, north of St. Paul, this is an example of the reinhabitation of a former Days Inn motel. It's on a mall out parcel, so it is on the kind of property of a shopping mall, into memory care units for people with and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of motel properties that could be repurposed for housing. The next challenge I want to touch on is to leverage social capital for equity. So we should all know by now that suburbs are not homogeneously the same, and that's amply presented in previous presentations, socioeconomically. However, they are highly fragmented and segregated places. They've been systemically structured that way, and these structures are very entrenched in governance structures, in zoning. So social capital's networks of civic trust and social cohesion among people in society provide pathways for individuals to increase happiness and well-being and to access economic opportunity. So how can retrofits raise the bar on this challenge? Reinhabitation type retrofits, adaptive reuse of commercial spaces, in those places, locally owned businesses flourish, building economic resilience, including among newly arrived immigrant groups. In redevelopment type retrofits, we can add and preserve housing affordability and choice. And regreening retrofits can provide equitable access to new public spaces and an enhanced or public and shared civic realm. And in this image, you can see happy kids skating at the Wyantant rink out on in Babylon. So Wyandanch Rising, this is my local example in these slides, is an ambitious redevelopment and regreening retrofit, many years in the making. I imagine some of you know more about it than I do. In 2000, the hamlet of Wyandanch was named Long Island's most economically distressed community. And over a lengthy 20 years plus ongoing process, it's being rebuilt with mixed-use affordable housing, much of it deeply subsidized, around a civic green on cleaned up brownfield and former parking lot next to the Long Island Railroad Station, which is also featuring new local retail, job training, and a co-working space focused on BIPOC-owned digital. And a reinhabitation example in Fort Worth, the Seminary South Shopping Center was built on a drained lake in 1962. It went through various permutations and incarnations, and it's now a highly successful Hispanic-themed mall with 120,000 square foot three-level mercado, which was built in one of the former anchor department stores. It's a small business incubator with 100 small little and La Grande Plaza regularly hosts such events as Mexican wrestling in the atrium and huge fiestas in the parking lots, and many of these are political rallies. Wow. Fifth challenge, compete for jobs. So switching focus to the millennial generation, now aged 23 to the late 30s, and the post-millennials or Gen Zers who are following them into the work. So old office parks and corporate campuses can be retrofitted to attract and retain these workers by pursuing urbanism explicitly as an amenity to attract employers, as at Domain outside Austin. Here's another image of that, the sort of before, where you just have the big single building surrounded by parking and slowly infilling and redeveloping around it. And part of what's really important here is the transit access. Or in this example, also in Austin, the community college, a branch of the community college has taken over the mall. So the Austin Community College. And then partners are building housing and office space on the parking lot around it. Again, the game changer is transit availability. So there's a combination of access to ready interns in the community college students, the transit, and the urbanism has attracted employers who then hire in for part of their. And then last in the 6 challenges, add water and resilience. So introduce green, soft infrastructure in place of gray, hard infrastructure for managing stormwater, as in this image. So you have a cottage court instead of a single house. You might build houses, and then in the green space, actually managing the stormwater, bioswales, rain gardens. We can regreen low elevation sites into larger stormwater parks to manage runoff, larger whole set of properties, add district energy to neighborhoods, optimize renewable energy, solar, wind. So in the downtown of working class Meriden, in central Connecticut, a stream was culverted and the Hub Mall was built over it during the urban renewal period. The site flooded catastrophically frequently. So it was all demolished and the creek was daylit and the site was regraded, so made it lower elevation and regreened as a stormwater park to be surrounded with new affordable apartments on higher, drier ground. So here are the 6 challenges and in conclusion, a reminder, the majority of Northern Americans already live different types and have done so for some multiple generations. So these places in all their varied forms are the dominant urban experience in Northern America. As more malls, office parks, and other gray field sites age, they provide myriad opportunities to redevelop, re-inhabit, suburbia in more community serving resilient.
Good afternoon. Wake up back there. My name is Joy Brown, and I come to this from a kind of a different non-academic perspective. And just like this is coming back down, I have no slides. But I am very magical. All right, so you've heard a lot here about what can be. My job is to talk to you a little bit about what is. And we're going to start off by giving you some idea of what the landscape looks like. At some point in time, we heard a lot of things about there has to be changes in zoning. To get to changes in zoning, you have to get to a change in policy. And to get to a change in policy, that involves politics. And I'm going to talk about this suburb. Let me tell you what you're up against. Nassau and Suffolk have 13 towns, 2 cities, 97 villages, 173 hamlets. In addition to that, we've got 124 school districts. Nassau has 56, Suffolk has 68. I'm wrong, hold on. These things make my glasses fog. So I'm going to lose you guys so I can read what I got in front of you. Suffolk has 68. That's a lot. How many is that? There, out of 3,066 counties in the United States of America, Suffolk places 4th in the number of school districts per county, and Nassau places 7th in the number of school districts per county, which means there's a whole lot of school districts here. And taken all together, Long Island has more than 900 taxing districts. That includes stupid stuff, light. There really are downtown lighting districts. They charge you for money to keep the lights on downtown. That's in addition to things that you really don't think about much, like library district and fire district. All of them have the ability to have some impact on Long Islanders' life. So, how do you change the politics of it when you have that many municipal districts? Well, there are a lot of opportunities here. We've got 2 senators, 5 members of Congress, only 1 of color. We've got 9 state senators, 1 of color, who also happens to be the first Indian American elected to the state Senate. We've got 20, where am I? I'm losing my, the point is there are a hell of a lot of public officials on Long Island. And of the hell of a lot of public officials on Long Island, very, very, very few of them are people of color. And because very, very, very few of them are people of color, or for that matter, women, or for that matter, young people, public policy that would be beneficial to you guys isn't getting done. I would submit to you that Long Island right now is undergoing, or has undergone, a change as profound as when we were talking about Levittown. After World War II, you had black and white GIs come to Long Island. They settled in separate suburbs as a result of federal lending practices. But there's a big difference. When they came back in the 40s, and they kept going through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the present day, making policies and putting policies in place, they had the advantage of having loans for education. You guys, you've got debt. They got loans. They also got loans for home. And the people coming to Long Island now, many of them do not necessarily, I can say flat out, they don't get the kind of loans that the people got back then. So we know a lot about post-World War II. What we don't know, and I don't think Long Island has yet to understand, is that we've had a slow revolution that has happened here since the 80s. Newsday published a lot recently about the changes in demographics. Let me tell you that those changes were predictable, and they were predicted back in the 1980s. We knew back in the 1980s that Asians would be the largest population on Long Island in the 2020s by percentage. We also knew back in the 80s that Latinos would be the largest population on Long Island in raw numbers. We knew that. Yet and still, you're to the point where the political system is just beginning to see and understand that. One of the funny, well, I shouldn't say funny. What's a good word? One of the more interesting things to me has been this: we're in a election year right now, and I see politicians naming places and buildings and streets after people of color. There were 2 in Huntington just last week. And they were recognizing people who deserve to be recognized, but people who have been working on trying to get that equity, that social equity, that racial equity, that housing equity, that economic equity for decades, for decades. And now we're naming buildings, but the one thing we're not doing is we're not sharing power. We're not, and that's the only way any of this is ever going to change. Last week, I was on a panel with a bunch of millennials and Gen Zers, and my job was simply to let them talk. And let me tell you what they said. What they said was, number one, Long Island doesn't work for us because we're not like those people who settled here. We don't like, or we're not necessarily interested in single family homes. We like to get together and party. Well, they didn't say party. They say they like to get together. So they don't want to live on isolated squares. They said they don't necessarily like to drive. Yet on Long Island, as easy as it is to get out to the East End on that long Long Island Expressway, you can't even get north-south. They say that they are burdened by loans. They say they need help in terms of wanting to stay on Long Island. They say they want good paying jobs. None of our infrastructure as it is right now supports what they want. We have a 20th century infrastructure on Long Island that does very, very little to help the 21st century residents and growing populations on Long Island. So there's a lot of hope here. There are a lot of good ideas here, but I need you to understand, of course, somebody on the panel is another boomer on the panel. And what he said was, he said, what has to happen here is you have to go and vote. And I kind of disagreed with him. I said, what has to happen here is that you have to raise your voices, you have to join us, you have to get involved, and you have to take this mother over. That's what's going to have to happen if you ever want anything. And I know it may sound weird and odd and ridiculous, but I think Frederick Douglass put it best when he said, power sees nothing without demand. It never has and it never will. Long Island, as is currently constituted, we pay homage to the loudest speaking voices. And the loudest speaking voices are not necessarily speaking in your interest. They're speaking in the interest of 20th century suburbia, which doesn't work anymore. But it's going to stay there until there's enough of a wellspring of a will to actually make things change. And with that, I'm done, dude.
Yes? Yes. Now you know why I enjoyed working with and for Joy all those years. Even if she used to beat me up all the time because she was stronger than me and smarter than me and tougher than me. Just 2 quick things before we get to questions, which are going to come from all of you. We didn't do the thing with the written in advance, so we'll hold our breath and take a chance there. One is that we have, Chris reminded me, we have an event on October 6th that focuses on some of the similar issues, but more on development itself. And there's a ton of development going on in these areas, particularly right across the street at the Hub, which goes to a lot of the themes that June was talking about, opportunities and potential challenges. The other I want to mention, just a quick self-promotion, at least for the center, is that it's a multidisciplinary operation. I like to say suburban studies from A to Z, arts to zoology. And we have on basis of gifts and grants and contracts. We're doing everything from the water quality testing, I forget who was talking about the sewage problems, the water quality testing in the Hempstead Bays. We're training minority entrepreneurs, diverse entrepreneurs, so they can join the supply chains of bigger companies, hopefully Hofstra as well. We are exploring the minority teacher hiring. We had a study that got a lot of attention that showed that 61% of the school buildings on Long Island don't have a single black teacher. We're in a lot of areas that may interest you. You may not think of the suburbs as a worthy place of study, but even if you go on to do work in all over the world, what you will learn and what you will get to do could put you in a good place for the future. And so if you're interested, professors and students and any community members who might be here, I'm not sure if we have them today, reach out to me, reach out to Chris Niedt, reach out to Martine, who does an awful lot of work with us, and a number of other professors who are contributors. And with that, I'd like to go to questions. I'm going to give priority first to students. We have microphones in just the one microphone there. If you would like to ask a question, and don't be shy, and don't worry about being polite, even though we do put a premium on that. Civil rather than polite necessarily. So please, I don't see people rushing and fighting it off. Come to the microphone. Anybody wants to ask a question, line up, that's good.
Hi.
Terrific, thank you.
For me.
If you could say your name and maybe even the school you're in, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. My name is Sofia Ramirez. I'm actually a Professor Niedt student. So my question actually has to do with the point that you just made right now about the lack of diversity, not just in what Ms. Brown was talking about in terms of our politics, but also just in terms of our lives. I know, like, I'm a mixed race Latina. I've grown up on Long Island my entire life. I didn't have my first professor of color until college. And I think we had one single black teacher, but she was a sub. And I met her like once in my senior year. So kind of putting the two of your points together, how are we supposed to take over a structure so that we can make it more representative of ourselves if from our very beginning being raised on Long Island, we're not given any role models, we're not given any people to emulate, to show us that we can actually be better? Because I know, like, my family, when they moved out here, like they were trying. I'm from East Meadow, and my mom was a banker. Like, she made good money, and they kept trying to show her lower income towns because they just assumed that she couldn't afford it. I know, like, my friends, I've been learning to code switch my entire life just so that I could be treated equally, just so that I could be taken seriously, even if it's not what I was really like. And I had friends who couldn't do that, and they were told, like, oh, well, what does it matter what math you take? You're not going to college anyway. So how are we supposed to topple an entire structure when in our towns we can't even find any representation?
Thank you. Who'd like to take a shot at that? Joy, do you want to start with that?
I'll take that one. What the heck, right? First off, what you're doing is you're voicing the experience of a lot of different people and families on Long Island. There has always been, even when I moved here 38 years ago, this assumption that you are something that you're not necessarily like. And it is very, very tiring, I will just say. And, I've been here long enough where I can say that I'm to the point, you have to be polite. I don't have to be polite anymore. So you keep polite as long as you can. A couple of things I want you to be aware of. One, Long Island, as I said, has changed. You need to be aware of where the change is and where you can go to get that kind of sustenance that you're going to need and those role models. You're going to have to be very active in that, just as I was active when my kids were coming up to make certain that they had different experiences on Long Island. Long Island can be very, very isolating. Let me talk to you about a couple of things. One, there are now 7 communities on Long Island, in Nassau and in Suffolk, that are majority Latino. Most people don't know that, which is pretty astonishing to me, right? In addition to that, we've got 2 communities that are majority Asian, right? And these communities don't fit the perception of what a minority community is. And neither, by the way, do many of these Latino communities, right? So you've got Jericho. Is Jericho a poor community? Hell no. No, it is majority Asian, okay? Hicksville, And this is where we get into the politics a little bit. When Hicksville began to change, and Hicksville is another majority Asian community now, right? When it began to change and those businesses began to spring up in downtown Hicksville, they were put through hell by the town government. Your signs are wrong. You got too many signs. The lettering's too big. The lettering's too small, right? So what had to happen here, and what's beginning to happen is a little bit, is that, people began to make their concerns known to town hall. The other biggest thing I can tell you is that I think that people of color on Long Island are beginning to realize that there is strength, that there are numbers, and that you can do something with those numbers. We haven't gotten to the point where everybody's working together yet, but we have more elected officials of color, not as many as we need. Can somebody tell me what immigrant group has the largest number of elected officials on Long Island? Haitians. Number 2, who's second? Salvadorans, one of the most recent immigrant groups. Who's had elected officials for the longest period of time? Puerto Ricans. Okay? Puerto Ricans. And in the town of Riverhead, there's a Latina woman. She was the first Latina to run for town office in memory. She was elected supervisor. She's the first Latina supervisor of Riverhead and the first Latina supervisor in the county of Suffolk. Now, I don't expect you to know all that, but I expect you to try to learn all of that so you can kind of see what's going on. A couple of groups I can send you over to, Minority Millennials. Look them up online. They have a whole process that they're doing. They told me they're going to burn this mother down if they don't get, no, they didn't say that. That's unfair. What they said is they will seek out third political parties or create third political parties if need be to get to the kind of structure and policies that they need to stay on Long Island. And they are committed, by the way, to staying on Long Island. So Minority Millennials, look them up. Anybody want to add something?
I would just say one of the things that's interesting, I mentioned the Assembly Square retrofit. I think there can also be coalition building. And I think that's a key piece of this. In that particular suburb of Boston, there had been kind of the old ethnic that had a lot of the political power for many generations. They were Italian, they were Irish background. We had coalitions of some new residents who had, they were architects, lawyers, and others who really had this environmentalist kind of sustainability agenda. And they joined forces with the new immigrant groups, have formed a coalition, and were able to show up at meetings, come with reports, file lawsuits, do all sorts of things to really break up the old kind of political networks that had been calling most of the shots. So finding allies, I think, so a part of this.
One other organization you might want to contact if you're particularly interested in the school issue, the Long Island Latino Teachers Association have been community research partners of ours. They're blue chip, they're committed. It might be good content.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Lily Bren. I am actually not from Long Island. I'm from Connecticut, in a very rural part. So my question is kind of more for June Williamson, because I found a lot of interest in your presentation today, just because I find a lot of just kind of passion towards nature and how there's a lack of that in Long Island. So I think mine's kind of a two-parter. First of all, just like, what are the major challenges that you experience when you go through the process of trying to rejuvenate kind of the inequity and just the lack of nature and just, I guess, the flexibility of multiple different choices in all arenas? Just like, what are you facing that based off of like policy, on the economic side, on the politics side? And then kind of where are you in terms of that process of finally getting communities to have all of those flexibility and opportunities, I guess?
And those are great questions. And what I do as a scholar is collect case studies, and then we try and draw out what some of the practices are and have reproducible lessons that others can draw upon. to change the way development is done. So I think increasing recognition of the benefits of biophilia and sustainable kind of factors, layering those into suburban projects is really, really important. And it's been a little bit of a lag because it's perceived as costing more in terms of upfront costs. But if things can be structured in terms of life cycle costs and other kinds of incentives to add those layers to projects, it's really, really helpful. And if the zoning can be addressed about reducing minimum parking, rethinking how places are formed so that less asphalt is needed, or maybe you don't build it and then until you see whether you need it or not. Those are all sorts of things. You can also, and actually I was just on a panel on Friday with one of the speakers was the principal at Olin Partners that designed the green, the civic green in Wyandanch. And they're working on a number of projects where they're doing green roofs and all of these sophisticated things to kind of increase the overall square footage of green surfaces. So it's not just sort of gardens and at ground level, but it can be on the sides of buildings, on the tops of buildings, and cumulatively all of that can have a tremendous sponge effect in terms of stormwater. And that's something that really has changed. The climate, the weather has changed. And so development types, the buildings that even if they functioned 20, 30, 40 years ago aren't functioning anymore. They're not managing those environmental processes. So it kind of has to be done. And why not also get some of these human health benefits at the same time, and aesthetic ones as well. And also the community kind of civic, having a shared community green versus optimizing the private backyard and personal space. And I think demographically, preferences are changing towards that. So it all is converging in a way that I think is quite promising. But it doesn't happen all at once because a lot of stuff's already built. But again, in the suburbs, there's a lot of potential in these vacant spaces. It may appear like it's built out. Long Island is landlocked and so on. But there's so much potential to infill and reshape these places that have already been urbanized once. There's time for new layers.
We're starting to come to the end. You should be, no, that's fine. You should be rewarded for standing as long as you did. So ask your question as briefly as you possibly can. It would be great. And why don't we see if we can get some first answers.
So my name is Mike Roller. I'm a senior political science, public policy, public service major. And I've always had a particular interest in just urban design and everything around it. Professor Dalton mentioned in your presentation that the car is one of the major reasons why we're so spread out these days. Joy, you actually mentioned in your presentation that people of my age have this need to not want to be spread out anymore. We want to come closer together. And I live right near the green development in Wyandanch. To me, that Wyandanch facility means so much because you're right next to the railroad. It's so easy for you to go to work to the city because you're right there. There's no need to own a car if you live in a facility like that. But if you want to restructure the way suburban society is today, a lot of it, in my own opinion, would involve ripping it up and starting over again, which very clearly isn't the solution. So I was just wondering if you guys had any comments on how you can restructure suburban society to make it less car dependent, and kind of reframing the entire structure so that people do end up being together and pedestrians can walk the streets safely.
I actually think we have a good example here on campus is that there is a 2-part bike lane running parallel to Fulton Avenue that is separate from the main drive lanes of the avenue on the Hempstead Turnpike, and having that kind of infrastructure where it is possible to walk and bike or run robots doing drone deliveries, whatever you want to call it. But having that kind of infrastructure, and since somebody has to start, and I think that's actually a great example we have here on campus. The trick is that this is a network, right? And a network's value grows exponentially as you develop more connections within the network. So having it on campus is a great start, but looking at those kind of political questions of how do you build that connectivity to have greater access to downtown Hempstead, or to get it across the expressway, or even just the more accessible walking access to the Coliseum, so not everyone is driving every time there's a game.
Yeah, I'm going to jump here real quick. You can go and take a look at some things that have been done. There are a lot of them. They're in smaller places. You can go look at Farmingdale. I always tease the mayor. They got a Starbucks over there now. Mineola. Look at Huntington Station. It's amazing what is going on in Huntington Station, and people really hated it, and now they don't hate it as much as they used to. Go take a look at Patchogue. Patchogue did it too much. They're trying to figure out how to scale back. There are bike trails. There are now new bike trails. You probably don't know about them that can take you up and down, and they're more in development. And we don't have city bikes out here. We have Bethpage bikes. So they are happening on a kind of a minuscule scale, but it is happening.
I'm getting signals. I'm sorry, Shira. I'm getting signals from the back to, is that wrap it up or stop? Stop. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions and you want to follow up with any of us, we're all pretty easily reached. So don't be hesitant.
Your presentation. I thought it